In this video, we'll be loading the saved data that we actually set up in a previous video, making sure that all of our menus actually reflect that data, and we'll also be talking about some of the issues you can run into whilst handling the loading of data and how we can avoid that. In future videos, we'll cover the saving and loading of keybinds specifically, polish up our menus, add some extra quality of life functionality, and a lot more. If you don't want to miss that, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell for notifications. As always, if you have any issues with the code, a mechanic or system you would actually like to see created, or just want to say hi, make sure to leave a comment. With that said, let's move into our editor and get coding. Now we're here, let's go and move into our scripts. And I've opened up a few of the scripts that we're actually going to need to be editing and changing in this. It's all of the settings related script, so subtitles button, the window mode button, the settings signal bus, the settings data container, save manager, resolution mode button, and the audio sliders. So let's go and move into our settings signal bus first. We're going to go set up a quick signal. This signal is going to be for loading our data. So what we're going to do is we're going to name it signal load underscore settings underscore data. This will be taking a settings underscore dict, and it will be typecasting that as a dictionary. Now let's go and set up a function for this so we can emit the signal. So func, then control V. So copy the signal name, type in func, control V to paste, and then we can type emit at the very start of that. Typecast it as void return. Now what we have to do is type load settings data dot emit, and then pass in the settings dictionary. Now you'll see here we have two here. We have the set settings dictionary and the load settings data. Now they are the same in function but different in name for a reason. It's kind of a good idea to have separated functionality for this. You can use the same signal for this, funny enough, but I like to keep things a bit more separated. It helps my brain a little bit. Now with our signal setup, let's move into our save manager. This is where we created the ability or the functionality to save the game. We're now going to go and create the function for loading the game. Now, loading data is relatively simple in Godot. First, let's create a function. So we'll call it func load underscore settings underscore data. It takes no parameters, it has a void return. Now, we need to check a few things. The first thing we need to do is check if the file that we actually want to use exists, because if it doesn't exist, we'll try to run and it will give us an error. We really don't want that. So we're going to write if not. So if something isn't or is not, so if not file access, now we're going to use the file access functionality, which is how you access files. Then we're going to use the file exists function, which just checks if a file exists. Then we're going to pass in the settings save path. So this is going to check specifically if settings data.save exists. Now, if it does not exist, we are going to return and do nothing. That way we don't run into any odd errors or errors with this specific thing not working. Now we're going to need to create a couple of variables. The very first one is going to be a var, and it's going to be the save underscore settings underscore data underscore file. You'll start to see some similarities with the on save or on settings save signal. So save settings data file equal to file access dot open. Now we're going to be using open with open encrypted with pass. If you're using encryption, this is what you're going to have to do. If you are not using encryption, you can just use open, and that's it. So now we pass in the save file path for the actual file that we want. Then we need to pass in, check this functionality up here, what we want to do, and then the password. I'm going to hit Control-C and copy the password to avoid any awkward typos. Then I'm going to write file access dot read. So we want to use read because we're now reading the file instead of writing it. Then we can just paste in the password after that. So this is our file being accessed, it's being opened. Now what do we want to do with it? Well, we want to go and load that data, but for this, let's go and create a new variable, and it's going to be called loaded underscore data. It's going to be a dictionary. So we'll set it equal to a dictionary like so. So an empty dictionary. Now we're going to need to kind of go through this line by line and figure out what our data is and actually write it into the loaded data dictionary. So how do we go about this? Well, we can use a while loop. While loops can be a bit dangerous if you don't have an end point. They can just kind of run forever. So we want to make sure we give it an end point. And funny enough, there is one. We're going to check the save settings file or data file dot get underscore position. So this is going to get the position in the text from the first line or first letter or first space. And then we need to check if that is less than the save settings data file dot get length. Get underscore length. There we go. So this is basically going to check, hey, what position am I at currently? Am I at position 1? Okay. The maximum length of this file is, I don't know, 10 positions. Just use that as a rough number. If I am less than 10 positions, keep running the code. Whereas if I am greater than or equal to this amount, stop. So that's our endpoint. So we're not having an infinite while loop running. So now we're going to create a new variable. This is going to be the JSON underscore string, because we are once again using JSON data. Now we're going to need to go save file or save settings data file dot get underscore line. So we're now going to get the line as a JSON string or stored inside of a variable for a JSON string. Now we're going to create a new variable. This is just going to be called JSON because it's going to be a JSON dot new. It just corrected that and I don't want it to. There we go, JSON dot new. There we go. And now finally we need to do something specific with this. Now, this is one of those lines where if you don't use it, it won't work, but if you do, it doesn't entirely make sense. Now, what we're going to write is var underscore past underscore result. And then we're going to set this equal to JSON dot pass. And then we're going to pass in the JSON string that we created as a variable here. Now, you'll notice there's a little bit of a difference between how I've named these, this specifically. This doesn't actually get passed into anything, so you'll always get a warning down here, like this one, unused variable, loaded data is not getting used, right? Loaded data will get used, so this will go, but the past result won't. And it says here, if this is intended, prefix it with an underscore for underscore loaded data. And you'll see if I actually do that, that error disappears. That is what's known as privating a variable in Godot. Now, there is no actual private variables in Godot. It's more of a for the developer or for the coder to kind of look at and go, this is a private variable. But it also stops specific warnings from happening. So now we're going to grab our loaded data and we're going to write set it equal to JSON dot get underscore data. Now what we can do is print out that loaded data. Hit Control S to save. And the ready function up here, I'm just going to load that settings data and see and make sure that this actually functions. There we go. As you can see now, down here, we're actually getting all of the data we want loaded. It's loading correctly, it's setting it up correctly. There will be some changes that we do make to our save data, and I'll get to that as we get to it. So I can now remove the print statement, and I can, for now, keep this load up here. Actually, we'll just remove that. Now we hit Control S and save. So now what we want to do is kind of top this off outside of our while loop. We are going to want to grab our settings signal bus. Then we want to omit that load settings data signal that we set up originally. Now, what we're going to want to omit with this is the loaded data. And that is why we created this variable outside of the while loop, so it's a bit easier to kind of use and set up. So with our signal being emitted, we now need something to listen to it. Thankfully, with how we've set this up in the past, we create this settings data container, which means we can now come down to where we handle our signals. And we can actually grab, so settings signal bus dot load settings data dot connect. And then we're going to connect this to on underscore data underscore loaded. Actually, let's do a on settings underscore data underscore loaded. Make it a little bit more pointed. There we go. Now we'll copy that name so we don't make any typos or anything along those lines. And then at the very bottom here, we'll create a new function for on data loaded or on settings data loaded. Typecast this as a void return, not a void. Void, there we go. Now, inside of this function that we created, we can do something kind of specific. Previous video, when we were saving our data, we actually set up all of these signal-related functions for setting what the window index, the resolution, the subtitles, master, music, and sound effects volumes are. Now, I named these on. What I should have named these to is set. Why? Because what we're actually doing is setting the variables that are up here. So I can go through and rename these, but to stop some things breaking, we're just going to leave it as on at the moment. And now we're going to go through and we're going to call each one of these functions. And we're going to pass in their specific variables. Now, how do we do this? Well, to do this, we first need to remember that this signal is actually taking a parameter. We're going to call it data, and it's going to be a dictionary. So it's taking a parameter of data of type dictionary. Now we need to actually do something with this data. Let's come to the very top here. Let's create a new variable, and it's going to be called loaded underscore data. It's going to be typed as a dictionary. It's going to be set to an empty dictionary, not a dictionary. There we go. Now that's the first thing we want to set. We want to go loaded data equals data. And now that is storing the data that we just loaded inside of a variable for us. Now this is a bit of a redundancy variable. And it's not entirely necessary. We don't actually need to keep or store this loaded data in this node. In fact, you may not want to in the future, depending on how large your game gets. But for now, it's a nice redundant variable that we may be able to put to use, or we might just get rid of in the future. So with that said, let's start going through our functions, calling these, and then passing in the correct parameters for them. So for on window mode selected, on underscore window mode selected, we need to pass in an index for int. So we know it's an index, we know it's an int. How are we going to get this? Simply, we can use data, or even better, we can use that variable we just set up, loaded data, dot window underscore mode underscore index. Now, how do we know this is what we're, this is the actual thing that we're accessing properly and we want to get this? Because our save file up here sets this. This is how we've actually set all of our save data, right? It's a dictionary, so we know window mode index exists, resolution index exists, master volume exists, music volume, sound effects, subtitles, move left, right, and jump. We know those exist. Actually, for now, let's go and get rid of the hotkeys or the keybinds. And I'm saying this because we will actually be doing something very, very different with keybinds in the next video. I want to make sure that keybinds specifically get their own video for a lot of attention. Keybinds can be a massive pain in game development, especially in Godot. I figured out a way of getting it kind of set in a very, very solid, very good kind of expandable way, and it will be its own video. So for now, let's just focus on these ones. First, I'm going to hit Control S and save. Then I'm going to go down, and we know that window mode index exists in our loaded data. We can also check this by printing our loaded data, like so. Probably helps if I call on settings data loaded. or just load in general. Let's go to the save manager and then go up here. And then let's go load settings data, press F5, get our settings loaded. There we go. I'm going to close that. Now, if we come down here and we look through this, so we've got jump, which would be move left, or that would be jump, actually, yeah. So we have the key for jump here. We have the key for master volume, music volume, resolution index, sound effects volume, subtitles, window mode index. These are the keys that we're going to be using. And as I said before, they are the keys that are within our dictionary that we originally set up here. So if you ever need help kind of remembering what you can, or what keys you need to use, you can scroll up to your create a dictionary function and just check this. Now, we could have created a specific resource for this, so we get autocorrect, which is honestly probably a better idea, but it's something that we will more than likely go into in the future. So what you can do to avoid unnecessary typos is you copy the key, you scroll down, you remember that this one is for on_resolution selected, and then we pass in a loaded underscore data dot, and then paste the resolution index. Now we'll do the rest for on music, on subtitles, on sound effects, etc., etc. I'm going to go through all of these and do that. So we're now setting these correctly here. Let's delete this print statement. We won't need it anymore. Now we need to create some more functionality for getting the actual settings that we want to get. Now, you could create one function. You could use a match statement, and you can use a lot of strings and things along those lines to just create one purpose function for, or all-purpose function for grabbing certain other functions. You could directly access the variables in this, but I personally don't enjoy doing that too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write some really, really quick and simple functions for checking two things. The first thing it's going to check is if the loaded settings exists or is not an empty dictionary. If it is an empty dictionary, return a default, quote unquote, default value. And if it does exist, return the window mode, like in this case, return the window mode index, like actually return the proper functions or variables. So to do this, we're going to go to the top because these are now accessor functions. We're going to write func get underscore window underscore mode underscore index. We are going to give this no parameters and then give it a return type of int. And that is because the window mode index is, of course, an int. Now we're going to check. We're going to go if loaded settings or loaded data is equal to an empty dictionary. So if it is equal to an empty dictionary, return 0. Now, why am I using 0? Why am I actually using a magic number, so to speak, in general? Well, let's first return the window mode index to make sure that we don't get any errors. And now let's think about this. This is one of those things I said I'd like to talk about. Specifically, one thing that kind of slips people's minds quite easily when creating systems like this is defaults. What is your default key? What is your default volume? What is your default HP, your default anything? Creating defaults and storing them somewhere. It's just one of those things that you don't, it kind of slips your mind until you actually start handling saving and loading of data and how that works. Because if I were to return something else or nothing in this case, it will just crash, right? It needs to be an integer and it needs to have something here. Now we could come up here and we could create a bunch of constants for each of our variable settings here, or we can go one little step further. We can go into our scenes folder. Realize I haven't created any resources in here, so I'm going to create a new folder in scenes. I'm going to call it resources. Oh, a folder with that name already exists. I'm blind. It's right here. There we go. I'm going to create a new folder in here, and I'm going to call it the settings folder. Then I'm going to create a new script. This is going to be the settings resource. Going to create that. Now I'm going to go and open the settings resource, move it into its proper folder, settings resource. I'm going to want this to extend the resource. So it creates a resource for us, or we can create a resource from it. Now I'm going to go up to these variables. I'm going to Control C to copy, and then I'm going to Control V to paste. Now I'm doing this so I can remember, one, what they're named, and two, make my life a little bit easier. So default window mode index is going to be a constant, window underscore mode underscore. Going to set this as an int, and the default will be 0. So the default will be, in this case, full screen. Now we'll do the same thing again for the resolution index. Let's create the default. There we go. Add default to the start of these. Underscore resolution underscore index. Once again, as an int. Set it equal to 0. I think 0 in this case is the smallest window setting. Create another constant for the master volume. Set this equal to a float. I'm going to set my master volume default at 0 because it's just a pain to deal with the music every time I launch the game to show something off. Now I'm going to set the default underscore music underscore volume. I'm going to set this at 50.0 because why not? Master is always muted, so it may as well make sure that other things are getting set correctly. Finally, sound effects underscore volume. And because I like to kind of keep these groups a little bit, finish this off, setting it equal to, we'll do 50.0 again. Now, just above the master volume and the resolution, and below the resolution index, I'll create one more for the default underscore subtitles underscore set. Set this equal to a boolean, set it equal to false. Now we have our variables kind of here and created. Control S and save. What else can we do with this? Well, we can do, I guess we could do a few things. We could use these as exported variables, or we could scrap them entirely and just keep this specific resource as its own thing. That way we can just add as many defaults as possible. So that's probably what we're going to do. I'm going to hit Control S and save. I'm going to do this. I'm going to give this a class underscore name of settings resource. This default settings resource. There we go. Hit Control S to save. Now I can go into settings. I can create a new resource. Call it the default settings resource, and we will get our resource from this. Then I can call this the default settings, hit save. We now have a TRS, or a resource, with all of these default settings inside of it. Now, why is that a useful thing? We can come up to our settings data here, and we can create a new either exported variable or just a new variable in general. So what I'm going to do is just a new variable. It's going to be a onReady variable, so onReady. Then we're going to go var default underscore settings. And then we're going to set this equal to a settings resource, and we're going to preload the settings resource that we set up a second ago. So the default settings TRES. Now, what does this allow us to do? Well, it allows us to, one, have our defaults created. So where I do return here, I can go into the default settings dot, and then return, let's see, the default window mode index. That way we're always returning defaults. you'll probably start to see kind of what I'm getting at with this. This is a very safer, more efficient, more effective way of creating this stuff compared to what I was doing originally. Now we're going to create a new function. This is going to be for the get underscore resolution underscore index. Once again, it'll be returning an int, not an index. Then if loaded underscore data equal an empty dictionary, return default settings dot, and then we'll return the default resolution index, and then we'll return the not the window mode index, the resolution index. There we go. And now we just need to create a new function for each one of these. These are the getting functions, so we can go and create all of these getter functions now. I'm going to write func get underscore. I could show you the fast way of doing this. So I write get underscore, do a void return, then go if loaded underscore data, empty dictionary, return. And then outside of this, we can just do return like so. This is a copy paste function, or at least that's what I like to call it, where we've got the very, very foundations or basics of our function set up. So now I can just kind of copy, paste, go through. So this would be get the master underscore volume. I forgot to do the final return here. Now let's think about what we just created, right? We have getter functions. This is so something else will be able to call a function and then get the result depending on if a value is true or false, which is perfect. We've got setter functions, which are controlled by signals, which are automatic. We don't even need to think about them, which is great. And then we have the loading of data here. This will load our data. It will then pass through the data that is loaded, which will pass into these setter functions. And then it will set our variables for us, which means all we now have to do is go through and set up the functionality for getting our or loading our data using these getter functions. So how can we go about doing that? Well, let's go and look at the audio slider settings specifically. Now, setting up the audio sliders is, we'll say it's interesting. We'll say it's interesting. And I say it's interesting because there's a lot of things that you have to kind of think about with this. Like, it's an order of operations thing. That's what I'm trying to say. Order of operations. I'm going to create a new function at the very top here. And it's going to be called load underscore data. So this is going to load the settings. I'll have a void return. And now, what is it going to need? Well, it's going to need a few things. More specifically, it's going to need to do this either on value changed function, which is probably what we're going to do. Yes, let's go and do the on value changed. Now we need to pass to a value. Well, we don't have a value, right? Unless we go into our settings container dot get underscore. So we can't just specifically go and get the individual like setting, right? We can't just sit here and go, okay, get the master volume, because this is going to be set to either master music sound effects, not just master. So how do we check that? Simple. We do a match statement. So we're going to go match, and then we're going to match the bus name. Now we're going to go and check the bus name. So we know there are 3 types of bus name. There is master, and we can just copy these keys. So first state will be master. So, okay, it's the master volume. If it is the master volume, we are going to want to pass through on underscore value changed, and then grab the settings container dot get underscore master volume. And that will now go and reset and change this value for us. Now, before we'll finish this off before I get into the next part. So let's go and set up one for the music. We'll do it again on value changed, settings container dot get underscore music volume. And then we'll do a final one for sfx. On value changed, settings container dot get underscore sfx volume. So we're getting our volumes. Now comes the problem of where do we actually use this load data function? Well, if we put it at the very bottom, all of our names, our labels, and our values are going to be set, right? And how are these getting grabbed? They're grabbing the bus name and the volume, which means we can't put this at the very end, otherwise it's not going to actually set all of our, or reflect in our menus correctly. So we need to figure out where to get this. Well, let's check the get bus name by index. What are we doing here? We are grabbing the index for the bus, or for the bus, and then we are actually setting it and setting our index correctly. So we need to do this right here, just after we get the bus name by index. Now I'm going to hit Control S to save. I'm going to hit F5, go to the options, go to sound. Everything is set at 0. I'm going to set these forward, escape, go back, hit F5, and go and check. Now we are loading all of our settings correctly. Put some sound on to actually show this off. We'll mute that, pull the master up, hit exit, exit, make sure all of our settings are scrolling correctly. Done. Okay, so that is our audio done. Now we need to go and create another function for the resolution mode. So we'll go func load underscore data, void return. We're going to go on underscore resolution selected. And then we're going to just go and set the index equal to the settings container dot get underscore resolution index. And you'll start to see this is kind of all we have to do now. Now I can call this in the ready function. I can just go on resolution selected, Control S to save. Not on resolution, load data, there we go. Hit S to save, hit F5. See how this is working. Let's go see if I change this, hit escape, do that, go check. Our resolution is changing, but the resolution name is not changing. So how do we go about kind of changing this, right? Well, simply, we could actually just go and set what the selected option is in our options button. Now, how do we go about doing that? Well, in our load data, we can go options button, dot, select, and then we need to pass in an index. Well, what's the index we're going to be passing into this? Well, we can do the same thing. We can grab the settings container dot get underscore resolution index. Now let's hit Control S to save, F5, go and check. Now our resolutions are setting correctly. It autoed to 1280 by 720. Let's go and check a lower version, make sure it's functioning, and it's functioning. Finally, we need to move into the subtitles and, of course, the window mode. So let's go and do the subtitles very quickly. Kind of the same thing as before, func load underscore data, void return. Now we need to figure out how we're going to kind of set this. Well, we need to go and check if the button is pressed on or off, and we also need to go and set, well, we actually just need to toggle the ball. Now, how do we do this? Simple. Set label text, and then we just set that to the settings data container dot get underscore subtitle set. There we go. Now we can go check. And now our subtitles are toggling correctly. Let's go and make sure by resetting the menu, controls, accessibility. There we go. It's toggling off, text is toggling and saving correctly. Perfect. Now let's move on to the final one, the window mode button. Now, window mode is a specific beast. Right now, I'm going to show you how to set between full screen and window, like save and load those things. Or, now this is the fun part, I could actually just go func underscore. So settings can be a little bit of, or window settings, window mode settings can be a little bit weird. There is an easy way of getting around this though, because of how we designed it. Go create a new function for load underscore data, give it a void return. Now we're going to grab on window mode selected. we're going to pass in the settings container dot get underscore window mode index. Now, how's this going to work? Well, it's going to pass in the index here, and then it's going to, one, emit that signal, and two, check the display server here, or it's going to change based on the index. But the issue is that will, of course, not change the actual display. So how do we change the display? Well, we've already done this. We just did this in a different option. We're going to grab the options button and then change the select. We're going to select the settings container dot get underscore window mode index. Control S to save. Let's go and change this and make sure. Exit. There we go. That is not saving because I forgot to load the save data. Move that function down below that. Load data. Bang. Now let's give this a test. We are saving window mode. Full screen, exit. Make sure one loads full screen. It did, and it saved the actual button for us. I'm going to do it one more time just to triple check and make sure. And there we go. So that is all of our settings, saving, loading, and updating for how we kind of want them to be saving, loading, and updating, other than key bindings. Now, as I said, I'm leaving key bindings into a different video. I'm going to give a pure focus on that. Key binding videos are very far and few between from what I found, so I plan on creating a whole thing about it so you can kind of learn how to do it. Yeah, that's it. We're done. That is our settings mostly done and loaded. We just need to do key bindings, which we'll do next video. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.